On the night of November 24th, 1971, a man fell out of an airplane, not by accident, not by force, by choice. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, at 10,000 feet above the dark wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a man stepped off the rear stairs of a Boeing 727 into cold, black air. He carried $200,000 in cash strapped to his body, a parachute on his back, and a secret no one has ever fully uncovered. He was never found. Not his body, not the money, not his real name. In over 50 years of searching, the FBI conducted what became the longest-running investigation in American history. Hundreds of suspects were examined, thousands of tips were followed, and yet, the man the world would come to know as D.B. Cooper simply disappeared. This is not just a story about a hijacking. This is a story about a ghost who walked among the living, planned the perfect escape, and vanished into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. But the real question has never been how he did it. The real question is, who was he? To understand what happened on that November night, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a Wednesday afternoon in Portland, Oregon. Back to a man who bought a one-way ticket and changed American aviation forever. The date was November 24th, 1971, the eve of Thanksgiving. Portland International Airport was busy. Families were traveling. People were heading home for the holiday. The terminal smelled like coffee and jet fuel, and the lines moved slowly. At the Northwest Orient Airlines counter, a man approached and purchased a single ticket. He paid cash. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was calm. He was polite. He did not look like someone about to commit one of the most audacious crimes in American history. Witnesses described him later as a man of average height, somewhere between 40 and 50 years old, dark complexion, dark sunglasses, a black tie, a dark suit, a plain brown paper bag held under one arm. Nothing about him stood out. That, as investigators would later realize, was entirely the point. He boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 bound for Seattle. The plane, a Boeing 727, carried only 36 other passengers. It was not a full flight. The holiday crowds had not yet peaked. Dan Cooper took his seat toward the rear of the aircraft. He ordered a bourbon and soda from the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner. He paid for it. He tipped. He was, by all accounts, completely unremarkable. But the real story was only beginning. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper passed a note to Florence Schaffner. She assumed, as many flight attendants did in those days, that it was the phone number of a lonely traveler. She slipped it into her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned over. He spoke quietly but clearly. "Miss," he said, "you had better look at that note." She read it. Her hands began to shake. The note stated that he had a bomb. It stated that she should sit next to him. It stated that the hijacking had begun. Schaffner did as she was told. She sat beside him. He opened the paper bag just enough for her to see inside. There were red cylinders, wires, a battery. Whether it was a real bomb has never been confirmed, but in that moment, it did not matter. It looked real enough. Cooper delivered his demands with the composure of a man ordering room service. He wanted $200,000 in cash, specifically in used, unmarked $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve. He wanted a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane upon landing. And he wanted the crew to fly him to Mexico City. He was not yelling. He was not threatening violently. He was simply stating conditions, as if this were a business transaction. And that precision, that calmness, that almost professional manner was the first clue that this was no ordinary criminal. The plane landed in Seattle at 5:39 in the evening. The FBI and airline officials scrambled. They had never dealt with anything quite like this. The money was gathered, the parachutes were located, negotiations were conducted through the pilots who relayed messages from the cockpit. Cooper kept his word on every point. While the aircraft sat on the tarmac in Seattle, he allowed all 36 passengers and one flight attendant to leave the plane. He kept the pilots, the co-pilot, a flight engineer, and one flight attendant named Tina Mucklow. The ransom was delivered, $200,000 in $20 bills. The FBI, working quickly, had photographed every single bill before handing them over. The serial numbers were recorded. The bills were bundled into a knapsack. Cooper accepted the money. He examined the parachutes. He asked questions about them that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking at. Then he gave his final instructions. The plane would fly toward Mexico City. The route would take them southeast. The pilots would fly low, no higher than 10,000 feet. The landing gear would remain extended. The aircraft would fly at the slowest, safe speed possible. The crew complied. At 7:40 in the evening, Flight 305 lifted off the ground once more. Tina Mucklow sat near the front with the flight crew. Cooper was alone in the rear of the plane. Nobody knew what was coming. Somewhere over the dense forest of southwestern Washington state, something happened at the back of the plane. Tina Mucklow later described a warning light activating in the cockpit. It indicated that the rear air stair, a unique feature of the Boeing 727 that extended from the tail of the aircraft during flight, had been activated. The captain called back to ask if everything was all right. Cooper said yes. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from him. At approximately 8:13 in the evening, the crew felt a slight change in air pressure, a subtle shift in the aircraft. Later analysis would determine that this was the moment someone stepped off the rear stairs. Cooper had jumped into darkness, into cold November rain, into the wilderness below. When the aircraft landed in Reno, Nevada, the rear of the plane was empty. The parachute, the money, the man were gone. D.B. Cooper had vanished from the sky. The FBI launched what would become the most intensive manhunt in the history of American aviation. Agents descended on the Pacific Northwest. The dense wilderness between Seattle and Reno was searched by air and by ground. Military units swept through forests. Volunteers combed riverbanks. Every lead was pursued. And they found nothing. Not a single footprint, not a scrap of parachute, not a dollar bill. The silence of the forest kept it secret. Investigators began to build a profile of the man they were hunting, and the more they examined the evidence, the more unsettling the picture became. Cooper had demonstrated a specific knowledge of the Boeing 727 rear air stair. This was not common knowledge. The air stair was a mechanical feature that very few civilians would have known about. Yet Cooper had used it perfectly. He had also asked intelligent questions about the parachutes, questions that indicated familiarity with skydiving equipment. He had specified the type of money he wanted, used bills in small denominations, difficult to trace. He had demanded enough fuel for a long journey, but given a destination, Mexico City, that investigators believed was a misdirection. Someone with this knowledge was not a random opportunist. This was a man who had planned. Over the following months, the FBI received thousands of tips. Every unusual man in the Pacific Northwest became a suspect. Former military paratroopers, disgruntled airline employees, experienced skydivers. The list grew enormous. One name that emerged in the early days of the investigation was a man named D.B. Cooper, a real person who lived in Oregon. He was quickly cleared. But his name had been leaked to the press and the legend was born. The hijacker had given the name Dan Cooper, but the media ran with D.B. Cooper, and that name stuck to the mystery like a brand. The FBI identified over 1,000 serious suspects over the decades. They narrowed those down to dozens. They investigated people with military backgrounds, people with aviation connections, people who had disappeared from their normal lives around the time of the hijacking. But every suspect either had an alibi, failed to match the physical description, or simply could not be definitively connected to the crime. The case went cold, then warm again, then cold again, This pattern repeated itself for 50 years. However, investigators discovered something unexpected in February of 1980. A young boy named Brian Ingram was on a family camping trip along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He was digging in the mud along the riverbank when his fingers touched something unexpected. Paper. Rotted, disintegrated, but unmistakably paper. He pulled out a bundle of $20 bills, partially decayed, bound together in a way that matched the FBI's original money bundles. The serial numbers confirmed it. This was D.B. Cooper's ransom money, or at least part of it, roughly $5,800 worth. The rest of the $200,000 has never been found. The discovery was thrilling and deeply confusing. The location of the money created more questions than answers. If Cooper had landed in the wilderness further north, how had the money traveled south to the Columbia River? Had the bundle washed downstream? Had someone else moved it? Had Cooper himself buried it near the river and the rest had washed away? No one could say for certain. The money told investigators that Cooper had either landed near the river or had not survived his jump. But it did not tell them who he was. It did not tell them where he had gone. The mystery deepened. Over the years, dozens of men came forward or were identified by family members as the possible, real D.B. Cooper. One of the most compelling suspects was a man named Robert Rackstraw, a former Army paratrooper and convicted con artist with a troubled history. He had the skills, he had the background. The FBI investigated him multiple times. He denied everything until his death in 2019. Another suspect was a man named L.D. Cooper, identified by his own niece, Marla Cooper, who told investigators that her uncle had behaved strangely around Thanksgiving 1971, returning home with injuries and speaking in ways that alarmed the family. The FBI tested DNA from a guitar strap belonging to L.D. Cooper. The results were inconclusive. A man named Kenneth Christensen, a former Northwest Orient Airlines employee and experienced parachutist, was identified by his brother as a strong candidate. He had worked for the very airline that Cooper hijacked. He had knowledge of the aircraft. But Christensen died in 1994, and direct proof was never found. Each suspect told a different story. Each one fit some part of the profile and missed other parts. The man known as D.B. Cooper seemed to be a combination of skills and characteristics that no single identified person perfectly matched. This was the mistake that changed the investigation entirely. Investigators had assumed Cooper was one type of person, but perhaps he was something more complex. Perhaps he was someone trained by institutions, by the military, by government agencies, in skills that crossed multiple disciplines. Perhaps D.B. Cooper was not simply a criminal. Perhaps he was a professional. The FBI officially suspended active investigation of the D.B. Cooper case in July 2016, citing the need to redirect resources toward other priorities. They stated that they believed Cooper had not survived his jump into the wilderness, but they did not close the case. It remains officially open. There are reasons to doubt the FBI's conclusion that Cooper died. The parachute he chose from the four provided was a military-grade chute. He had enough skill to operate the rear air stair mid-flight. The money found on the Columbia River, while damaged, suggested that at least some of the ransom had survived exposure to the elements. And there is a more psychological reason to question the conclusion. D.B. Cooper did not behave like a man who expected to die. He was calm. He was organized. He had a plan. He had a destination. Men who plan to die do not usually plan quite so carefully. The wilderness of the Pacific Northwest is vast and brutal. November is one of the coldest and most dangerous months to jump into that terrain. Without landing perfectly, without navigating successfully, survival would have been almost impossible. Almost. The story of D.B. Cooper matters not simply because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed about America in 1971. The country was in turmoil. Vietnam was dragging on. Trust in institutions was collapsing. Watergate was just around the corner. and into this atmosphere walked a single man who outsmarted the FBI, outsmarted an entire airline, and disappeared without a trace. To many Americans, D.B. Cooper became something more than a criminal. He became a symbol, a folk hero, a man who had beaten a system that many people were already beginning to distrust. Songs were written about him, movies were made, books were published. Every few years, a new lead or a new suspect would surface, and the story would burst back into public consciousness. The hijacking inspired a change in aviation security regulations. Because of Cooper, the FAA mandated that all Boeing 727s have their rear air stairs locked during flight. The modification became known informally as the Cooper vane. One man's disappearance permanently changed the way Americans fly. The truth is, we may never know who D.B. Cooper really was. The DNA evidence collected from the tie he left behind on the aircraft has never produced a confirmed match. The money recovered from the Columbia River has not led investigators to a final answer. The suspects who have come and gone over 5 decades have all remained exactly that, suspects. What we are left with is a shadow, a profile constructed from fragments. A man in a dark suit who bought a one-way ticket, handed a note to a flight attendant, and then fell backward into the darkness of a November night over the forests of the Pacific Northwest. He was confident, he was prepared, he was unhurried, and then he was gone. Whether D.B. Cooper survived or not, whether he spent the money or buried it, whether he lived quietly for decades under a different name or died in the trees below, one thing is certain: he won. On the night of November 24, 1971, while 36 passengers were let off a plane and flew home to their families for Thanksgiving, one man flew in the opposite direction, not toward warmth or comfort or family, toward darkness and wilderness, and a gamble that defied all reasonable odds. Maybe he made it. Maybe he did not. But somewhere in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, or in the files of an FBI office, or in the faded memory of someone who once knew a man who came home one November night with mud on his boots and never spoke of where he had been, somewhere the answer exists. The sky swallowed him whole, and it has not given him back. The D.B. Cooper case remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in American commercial aviation history. The FBI officially suspended active investigation in July 2016, but the case has not been closed. Approximately $5,880 of the ransom money was recovered in 1980. The remaining $194,120 has never been found.